Nostalgia is everywhere. It's in the neon-lit reboots that take over streaming platforms, the vinyl records that we proudly stack next to our Bluetooth speakers, or the recycled fashion trends that we pluck from decades past. We're not dabbling in the past anymore, we're drowning in it. I get it though, like this constant swirl of old movies, fashion, and music feels familiar, like slipping into an old pair of jeans that you found in a thrift store or something. But scratch the surface a little bit and a nagging question arises. Why does it feel like the 2020s doesn't have its own flavor? Why are we so obsessed with dragging the past forward rather than bringing new ideas to light? We're caught in this constant loop of replays, remixes, and throwbacks. Music, movies, fashion, and television no longer feel like clear markers of a decade's identity. The 80s had glam and synths, the 90s had grunge and angst, the early 2000s had bubblegum pop and frosted tips. But what do we have now? All of these things, really. A great example of this is if you saw a picture or video from the year 2000 and you had no context of what year it came from, you wouldn't know what year it came from. Like, we're revisiting everything. So it begs the question, have we run out of original ideas, or are we just too overwhelmed to try something new? Don't get it twisted though, we were becoming obsessed with nostalgia before the 2020s. If our collective obsession with the past was already simmering in the 2010s, the pandemic turned up the heat. During the pandemic, the world ground to a halt. Planes were canceled, workplaces were shuttered, and millions of people found themselves confined to their own homes with little more than their own thoughts and their streaming subscriptions for company. Of course, not including your pandemic pets or your significant other who you were growing tired of. Suddenly, the present seemed way too overwhelming to deal with, and the future seemed too uncertain. And in that instance, what's left? Well, the past, of course. Nostalgia became a coping mechanism and a cultural cornerstone. That level of isolation created a perfect storm for nostalgia to thrive. Stuck at home, people craved comfort and familiarity. Watching reruns of The Office or old Disney Channel shows, or replaying your favorite childhood video game became ways to escape the chaos outside. These weren't distractions, they were lifeboats to remind us of a simpler and safer time. Streaming platforms quickly capitalized on this. Disney Plus saw explosive success with its vault of classics, while Netflix heavily relied on sitcoms like Friends and Seinfeld. Even YouTube saw a resurgence of old clips and compilations from decades past. Revisiting all these things from the past made it feel like we were reconnecting with old friends when actual friends were scarce. And music also followed suit. Songs from previous decades surged on platforms like Spotify, as people created throwback playlists to recapture the happier moments. TikTok became a nostalgia engine, with teens embracing song styles and aesthetics from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And the result? A culture that felt less like it was creating something new and more sifting through its greatest hits. And all of this didn't just impact what we consumed, it impacted what was being made. Movie productions were delayed, live shows were canceled, and fashion shows had to be moved to online platforms. Creativity slowed, and instead of looking for new things to do, creators leaned into what was already done. Or rather, people that were funding the creators did. For instance, Hollywood, which was already flirting with nostalgia, doubled down on its effort. Reboots, sequels, and remakes became even more prevalent because they required less risk during an already precarious time. Why greenlight an experimental indie project when you can guarantee returns on another Spider-Man or Top Gun? Studios needed sure bets, and nostalgia delivered. The same thing applied to music. With live tours off the table, artists leaned on virtual platforms and nostalgic marketing strategy. For instance, Taylor Swift's Fearless and Red re-recordings struck gold not just because they were brilliant albums, but because they tapped into fans' deep-seated yearning for a time before chaos. On a deeper level, the pandemic was a time of collective grief, not only for the lives lost, but for the loss of normality or normalcy. Normalcy or normality? Normalness. Normal stuff wasn't happening no more. Nostalgia offered a way to process this grief. By visiting the past, we weren't just indulging in escapism, we were getting something that felt more concrete and never changing since it already happened. We already have these things. It also affected how we approach fashion, television, and pop culture. People embraced clothing trends that felt playful and familiar, from Y2K inspired crop top to tie-dye sweatpants, reminiscent of summer camp crafts. Even social media trends like TBT or Throwback Thursday regained new life because people wanted to look back at the past. This time didn't just amplify our nostalgia, it left us in a cultural limbo. As a result, the 2020s feel less distinct and more like a patchwork stapled together with Wi-Fi. I mean, think about it. What is the defining fashion trend so far? We're halfway through the decade. You can't tell me. Or if you can tell me, I guarantee you it's something that already happened from a decade past. That almost never happened before. People from the 50s dressed absolutely nothing like people from the 90s, who dressed absolutely nothing like people from the 70s, who dressed absolutely nothing like the people from the early 2000s. And it's not like we don't have the time to create things new, we just don't have the mental bandwidth right now. Innovation often comes from collaboration, experimentation, and risk-taking. Three things that were in short supply during years of lockdown, but also aren't as strong because of the result of those lockdowns. People mentally aren't as sociable, especially the younger people who set the trends and make cool things cool. We're still in recovery mode, and until we emerge, it's easier to cling to the things that have already happened than to forge ahead. But like I said, this didn't start in the 2020s. I mean, we always had nostalgia, but why does it seem like this generation is clinging to it more than ever? It can't be just the pandemic. The one thing that people born in the 90s all the way through to the 2000s had that no other generations had was the internet. In the digital age, the past isn't just a memory, it's a clickable, scrollable, endless archive of history that is at our fingertips at all times. You want to relive the 90s? There's a YouTube playlist for that. Curious about fashion from the 70s? There are Pinterest boards brimming with bell-bottom jeans and fringed jackets. The internet has turned every decade into a readily available aesthetic, an on-demand experience that lets us pick and choose elements from the past with ease. And all this access to the past is stunting our cultural growth, making it more difficult for us to come up with new trends and ideas. Let's rewind to, say, the 80s. In the 80s, if you wanted to experience life back in the 50s, your options were pretty limited. Maybe you could look through old photo albums or listen to a throwback radio station or watch reruns of shows like Happy Days, which in itself was made in the 70s. I mean, the past existed in fragments, but it was really just out of reach and required imagination to fill in the gaps. And because of this, previous generations had no choice but to create their own music, their own fashion trends, and their own cultural identity. They didn't have an infinite catalog of history at their fingertips. Compare that to today. You want to know what your mom wore in high school? Well, you can find trends from that year all categorized on social media to show you exactly what that was. You interested in what music your grandparents listened to? Spotify has curated playlists from every decade. Entire subreddits are dedicated to recreating and romanticizing bygone eras, from the gilded opulence of the 20s to the grunge aesthetics of the 90s. This easy access has created a cultural stagnation which makes the past not something to learn from, but something to copy. Because the past is so readily accessible, it's easier to recreate than innovate. Why create something new when you can cherry pick the best parts of other decades that were tried and tested and already were popular? Instead of pushing boundaries, we're remixing old ideas. Fashion designers reintroduce Y2K trends almost verbatim. Musicians are sampling, covering, and remixing songs from decades ago. Even social media aesthetics like cottagecore or dark academia are repackaged versions of old world charm for modern audiences. And this isn't inherently bad. Some of the most exciting art comes from remixing and reinterpreting the past. But when it becomes a default mode of creation, it blocks the emergence of new ideas. Previous generations didn't have this issue because their access to history was limited. They couldn't immerse themselves in endless reels of retro content, so they had to look forward. In contrast, we're living in a time where the past is so accessible that it's overshadowing the future. Social media platforms thrive on this stuff. Vintage aesthetics, retro songs, and styles, it's just all coming back and being regurgitated to us every single day. The internet doesn't just make the past accessible, it actively pushes it into the forefront, crowding out the potential for originality. This feedback loop means that it's harder for new trends to break through. Even when something fresh does emerge, it often gets absorbed and reshaped by nostalgia. For instance, Billie Eilish's innovative whispery sound became a phenomenon, but it didn't take long for critics to compare her to artists like Lana Del Rey or to pigeonhole her into a lineage of moody, introspective musicians from decades past. But there's an even deeper layer to this, the fear of failure. The internet's vast history of cultural archives makes it impossible to not live in the shadow of things in the past. And it sets an impossibly high standard for new and emerging creators to create something innovative. If your work is being compared constantly to legendary things from decades past, how can you ever feel that it's good enough? Why bother reinventing the wheel when you can borrow from a wheel that already rolls perfectly? Previous generations didn't have this problem. If a band in the 80s flopped, they weren't immediately compared to like the Beatles from the 60s. Now we exist in a space where nostalgia isn't just a comfort, it's competition. Not to mention all of the competition that surrounds us in modern times. So you look over here and you're competing with nostalgia, and you look over here and you're competing with the person standing next to you. How can you stand out? The internet has given us an incredible gift to access and preserve history like never before. But this gift comes with strings attached. Our constant engagement with the past leaves little room for the present to breathe, let alone the future to take shape. But not all aspects of our nostalgic obsession is a cultural dead end. In fact, the revival of interest in physical media and analog formats has sparked a resurgence of creativity, hobbies, and collecting that might not have otherwise existed. Formats like vinyl records, Blu-ray discs, VHS tapes, and film photography, once considered relics of a bygone era, have all seen a remarkable resurgence in recent years. I mean, people are finding joy in analog and physical media like never before, and it changes the way you move throughout the world when you have these things. I mean, vinyl was once considered completely dead, overtaken by CDs and then digital media. But now it's like everywhere I go, every home that I enter has a vinyl record player. And besides the superior quality of the audio, the more tactile experience of loading up a vinyl record and dropping the needle is different from just clicking play on your phone. The same goes for VHS tapes and film photography, which have inspired entirely new waves of creativity. Film photography in particular has attracted younger generations eager to experiment with the unpredictable and intimate qualities that it brings. In a world of endless filters and editing, the performance and imperfection of film feels refreshing and deeply personal. Similarly, VHS tapes, long considered obsolete, are finding new life among collectors who prize the nostalgic grain in analog visuals. Some even use VHS as an artistic medium to embrace the limitations and produce content that feels uniquely retro yet modern. Blu-rays, meanwhile, have become a haven for film enthusiasts craving high-quality physical media. And you can even see this in the rise of motion picture films' popularity in the last 10 or 15 years. More and more films on independent levels and in the mainstream Hollywood levels are shooting their movies on film. And even the money men have gotten involved in this, using the screening of actual film prints as a marketing platform for more people to go to theaters. I mean, how many of us saw Oppenheimer on 70mm? But even still, this shows how nostalgia has such a grip on us. It's just a weird nostalgic world that we're living in. Turn on the radio and chances are you'll hear a faint echo of a song that you already know. Maybe it's the bass line that screams Ice Ice Baby but isn't. Or the hook that's unmistakably Britney Spears but is chopped and sped up and claimed by a new artist. Sampling isn't new. I mean, hip hop and dance music have been built on repurposing for decades, but lately it seems like the industry has leaned heavily into nostalgia rather than originality. Why is that? Because nostalgia sells. Gen Z is embracing tracks like Running Up That Hill from Fleetwood Mac as if it was a freshly minted hit because, well, to them it is. TikTok is a cultural tastemaker for old songs to become popular again. And the issue isn't that these songs aren't good. I mean, they're great. That's why they were popular in the first place. But it also makes it more muddy for newer tracks to become popular. It seems like there are far less new artists coming out than ever before, even though we have far more new artists making music than ever before. Music from unknown artists just isn't hitting like it should be. Not because of lack of quality, but because of our attachment to the past. And streaming hasn't helped. I mean, we have every song ever made at our fingertips, so why listen to things that we don't know when we can always go back to that old familiar sound? Movies are no different. We're in a land of infinite reboots and sequels. Go to a theater and I'm sure you'll see a new Jurassic Park or Ghostbusters or Top Gun coming out sometime soon. I mean, for an artistic medium built on storytelling, it seems like somebody decided that audiences would rather see the same story over and over, just in new shiny packaging. I lost my breath for a second. And of course, this is all done for money. Studios know that familiarity puts butts in seats, whether it's a new Batman or some kind of remix of The Lion King. We're gonna see these things happen over and over because of our attachment to the past. New intellectual properties are way too big of a risk for studios to put out, especially when they know no matter what the quality is, we'll go and support something that we have an attachment to. But we've stripped movies of their ability to challenge, surprise, or define our cultural moment. The 1970s had gritty realism, the 1990s had independent, offbeat genius like Pulp Fiction. The 2020s, well, we're swimming in multiverses, nostalgia bombs, and CGI. Thrilling, but also a little hollow. And of course, in fashion, everything is in style now. You have the Americana style that resembles fashion from the 1950s. You have bell bottoms, very popular right now, and that's obviously from the 70s. You have the 90s that seems to never die, and then you have the early 2000s, which seems to be super popular amongst the youth. But the thing is, all of these decades had their own defining styles, and what do we have? Just remixes of what they've already done. Look, I guess the point of this video isn't really to bash nostalgia, because I don't think nostalgia is necessarily bad. I mean, looking in the past creates new things all the time. But me looking around the present, I'm not really seeing a defining aesthetic or sound or movie style of the 2020s. Instead, I'm seeing things that we've already done being repopularized, and eventually we're gonna run out of things that have already come. I mean, next thing you know, we'll be wearing togas and robes and shit. Please do not make togas and robes and shit popular. That just don't. I don't know. I'm just saying shit. If you want to stay in the past, stay in the past. If you want to look into the future, look to the future. But if we're not looking to the future, if we're not allowing creatives to innovate, if we're not allowing the people to latch on to new things, then we're going to stay in the past. And then future generations will look back at us as the nostalgic generation rather than innovators of our own culture and style and aesthetic. And that's no fun, right?